As many of you know, the reason there are 2 Gill lectures this term can be attributed to the difficult weather of last January when Joel Kotkin was unable to successfully make his way to New England from California. Joel was able to reschedule his visit east, and he delivered his lecture on October 20th. Tonight, Kenneth Frampton will deliver the 31st Gill lecture. The Gill series was endowed by San Francisco architect Herbert McLaughlin, Yale College class of 1956 and Yale School of Architecture 1958. The Gill Lectures series has a distinguished history, bringing important critics and historians to our school. Previous Gill lecturers have included Wendy Steiner, Esther DaCosta Meyer, David Hickey, Charles Jenks, Roger Connor, and Hal Foster. This is Professor Frampton's second Gill lecture. In spring of 2000, he delivered the lecture Perspecta in the late 1960s, the end of the beginning. The diversity of the roster of Gill lecturers is as it should be, given that Brendan Gill, Yale College class of 1936, was a writer with wide-ranging interests, who during a long career was associated with the New Yorker magazine, contributing drama criticism and architecture criticism, taking over the Skyline column that had previously been Lewis Mumford's. Tonight's lecture accompanies the current exhibition in our gallery, Gwathmey Siegel, Inspiration and Transformation, which is the first ever comprehensive exhibition of the work of Gwathmey Siegel architects. Inspiration and Transformation was organized by the Cameron Art Museum in Wilmington, North Carolina, where it was on display from June 22, 2009 through January 10, 2010. The exhibition was curated by Douglas Sprunt, Adjunct Curator of Architecture and Design at the Cameron Art Museum, who is with us here tonight, as is Robert Siegel, key partner, close associate, and a contributor to the work in the gallery. So we welcome them both here. Maybe they would just acknowledge themselves with a wave of the hand. So people, Bob Siegel, Douglas Sprunt. There are many people here also from the Gwathmey Siegel office, and we welcome them one and all to the exhibition, to the talk, and to Yale. In planning the exhibition, Mr. Sprunt worked closely with Charles Gwathmey, who died in the summer of 2009. I thank Doug Sprunt for his gracious cooperation in making it possible for us to have this exhibition in our school. And I also take the opportunity to welcome a great friend of our school, Betty Ann Gwathmey, who is also with us here this evening. Betty Ann. An illustrated catalog accompanies the exhibition with a wonderful essay by the architectural historian Stephen Fox of the Rice University School of Architecture and interviews with the architects and selected clients. Charles Gwathmey was the only child of the noted social realist painter Robert Gwathmey and Rosalie Gwathmey, a respected photographer and member of the Photo League. Charles Gwathmey first met his future partner Robert Siegel at the High School of Music and Art in New York City. Gwathmey studied architecture under Lou Kahn at the University of Pennsylvania and went on to study and work under Paul Rudolph here at Yale, where upon graduating was awarded the Winchester Traveling Fellowship, the school's highest design prize, as well as a Fulbright grant that enabled him to travel to France and to visit the work of Le Corbusier. Robert Siegel studied architecture at the Pratt Institute and received a master's degree from Harvard School of Architecture. The two reconnected while working in the office of Edward Larrabee Barnes, key figure of architect, as a practitioner, and a man who had a great working staff in the 1960s and 70s, and has a tremendous influence on the architecture of his own generation and the succeeding generation. And then, after leaving the Barnes office, they founded their own practice based on the success of the house and studio Gwathmey designed for his parents in Amagansett in New York between 1965 and 67. One of the leading architects of his generation, Charles Gwathmey, was a brilliant talent who found his artistic voice early on and kept to his vision of what modern architecture should be through a lifetime of intense professional practice. Talent and a continuing commitment to a clearly defined set of aesthetic principles were his hallmarks as an architect. He embodied a ferocious integrity in both his work and his personal behavior. He was a friend to all of us who were lucky enough to know him, but to the many architects who knew him as a mentor and a standard bearer for excellence, he was even much more than that. From his student years on, it was clear to very many of his teachers, fellow students, and later fellow architects that Charles Gwathmey was one of the towering talents of his generation. While most architects stumble along a professional path, Charles seemed to always know the way. After traveling Europe and settling in New York, working in Ed Barnes's office, then the top studio, as I've said, for young talent, Charles soon embarked on his independent career, which is of legend and history. Charles not only designed those structures for his parents, which electrified the profession, but also participated in their construction. This was no ad hoc do-it-yourself project, however. The Rosalie and Robert Gwathmey house and studio were meticulously crafted to the smallest detail. Moreover, they were dazzlingly composed in relationship to each other and their site, with form and space entirely liberated from the constraining biases of the conflicted 1960s to incorporate lost lessons from high modernism of the 20s. I am sure Kenneth Frampton will, I hope he will agree with that interpretation. I'm always nervous about that, but I'm sure he will elaborate on that. So I don't want to take your time further analyzing Charles's great contributions to the history of architecture. But I do want to say that the sense of a building art was central to Charles Gwathmey's work, and when he and Bob Siegel were hired to do this project, that is to restore this building and to add on to it and create the Lauria Center for the History of Art next door, they threw themselves and their team into it with intense commitment and got this job done in 18 months from the moment they were shocked to find that they had been interviewed and 15 minutes later hired by the university and then told that was the good news, but the bad news was they had 18 months to get the thing done, and they did. So that is not only artistic, but professional work at the highest level. Kenneth Frampton, tonight's lecturer, is no stranger to our school. He has generously contributed his time and talents to our studios and to our various symposia. Professor Frampton, Ware Professor of Architecture at Columbia School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, is a graduate of the Architectural Association of London. His publications are essential reading for those who wish to understand the work and theories that characterize modernism's complex history in the late 20th century. The architects who have benefited from Ken's monographic analysis include modernist masters like Le Corbusier, Mies, Alvar Aalto, as well as some of today's most important talents, including David Chipperfield, who's with us in the audience, Richard Meyer, Tadao Ando, Alvaro Siza, Stephen Hall, the Hariri Partnership, and Charles Correa, to name but a few. But it is to his widely admired Modern Architecture, A Critical History of 1992 that one must turn to get the full sense of Professor Frampton's commitments to the forms, values, and ideologies of the modern movement. Please join me in welcoming Ken Frampton as he returns to our school's podium to deliver the Brendan Gill Lecture, Gwathmey Siegel, Form and Counterform.
Not sure I have to give the lecture, but anyway, some of the ground has already been covered. Thank you for that very warm introduction, and I'm very honored to be here. And I would say somewhat nervous to be giving this lecture before such an august and profoundly connected body of figures that were part and parcel of Gwathmey's life, above all Betty Ann Gwathmey, Robert Siegel, and Douglas Sprunt towards the end of Gwathmey's life. These are the two figures, of course, that are the main principles of Gwathmey Siegel Associates, appropriately shot against glass block. What I'm going to do this evening is to read this paper, but with sort of intervening informal comments. One cannot approach the work of Gwathmey Siegel without addressing the multiple origins from which their work appears to stem. I have in mind, in the first instance, the American balloon frame timber tradition, as this was transformed by the immigré Bauhaus masters who were warmly received by the modernizing East Coast elite, as constituted in the late 30s by such figures as Alfred Barr, James Johnson Sweeney, and above all Joseph Hudnut, who was responsible for bringing Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer to the GSD at Harvard. As we know, there were other significant Bauhaus immigrants fed into the States via Black Mountain College, Yale University, and two radical design institutions established in Chicago, Mahoy Naji's Institute of Design and Mises Faculty of Architecture at IIT. As far as the East Coast is concerned, one has to acknowledge the exceptionally seminal role played by Marcel Breuer, since it was he who seems to have been able to create overnight an extraordinarily sympathetic modernizing manner with which he was able to fuse the functional legacy of the German Neue Sachlichkeit with the empirical white clapboarded fieldstone domestic tradition of New England. One first encounters this in Gropius's own house in Lincoln, Massachusetts of 1937, and then later in the Chamberlain Cottage designed by Breuer for Wayland, Massachusetts in 1939. That's still Lincoln. We see the fieldstone in prominence at grade, and here the Wayland Cottage. This so-called new humanist manner, a coinage invented somewhat later by Ian Nairn of the Architectural Review, was in the end one of the primary substrates, so to speak, from which 30 years later the incisive domestic manner of Charles Gwathmey will eventually emerge. The catalyst in all of this was surely the post-war American modernist architect Edward Larrabee Barnes, who, having studied at the GSD, found a way in his own work of translating Breuer's new humanism into a sharper minimalist manner, as we find this in the houses he designed and realized between 1950 and 1971, in which outriding fieldstone walls, standing seam roofs, tight white boarding or shingle siding, along with freestanding chimneys, were combined with carefully proportioned fenestration and pitched roofs into precise abstract assemblies. Typical of this work by Barnes was the Cowles House of 1962, the Richter House of 1965, which is not that, but that, and the Heckscher houses in Maine of 1974, of which this is a view of one of the houses. They were set up on a kind of podium, which we see here in plan, linking these different separate units of the weekend residence. Both Gwathmey and his future partner, Robert Siegel, worked for Barnes during this fertile period, with Siegel already serving as the straw boss, so to speak, of the practice by 1963, which happened to coincide with the time when Gwathmey joined the firm. Gwathmey started to moonlight almost as soon as he entered Barnes's office, much to the latter's subsequent shock and annoyance when Gwathmey's shingled Miller House, built on Fire Island in 1964, was published in the same issue of Progressive Architecture alongside a house by Barnes. Very diplomatic. And of course, we can see here already in this plan something of the pinwheeling idea that will finally, as it were, be contained in a single prism. In the canonical Amagansett house, designed and realized by Gwathmey for his photographer mother and painter father between 1963 and 65. Gwathmey's exceptionally touching account of the way in which this house came into being tells us a great deal, not only about the house, but also about the future ethos and modus operandi of the Gwathmey Siegel practice. I'm alluding to Gwathmey's possessive attitude towards domestic design, as this was set down in the book Gwathmey Siegel Houses, published at the Millennium. I quote, "When my mother and I bought the land in Amagansett, a 1-acre flat field with views across the dunes to the ocean and surrounded by undeveloped land, my mother said, 'Do what you would do for yourself. Just take our program and make believe it's yours.' That, in fact, is the way we do all our houses. We inherit the program from the client. We take the site, we take the orientation, we take all the things that affect or impact the opportunity, and we make it our own. In that way, we become so integrated with it and emotionally part of the process that it could never be detached or automatic or repetitive. Each time it's an invention. The chance to build this house for my parents was an incredible opportunity. Building it clarified for me that architecture doesn't have to be big to have presence or content, that a building as an object on the land, though small, in this case only 1,200 square feet, can occupy a site with sculptural monumentality. This house, as in all our houses, is in the section rather than the plan that the primary space is defined. It is the volumetric manipulation and the vertical rather than the horizontal description that articulates and defines the space. The public spaces, living, dining, and kitchen, one level above grade, capitalized on the views and established a relationship between the living space and the ground plane that was at the time unique in modern rural house architecture, end quote. One might note this adjective, rural. Two features of this work which have perhaps not been sufficiently highlighted up to now is first the absolute canonical character of the form, making it comparable to the stature, say, of the Rietveld Schroeder house of 1924, or even Le Corbusier's Maison Cook of 1926. And second, the surreptitious homage it pays to Paul Rudolph's Art and Architecture building in Yale, from which Gwathmey had graduated under Rudolph's effective tutelage in 1962. This debt became clear at the time in a photographic blow-up of a Greek relief, as this is superimposed on the balcony front of the bedroom overlooking the double-height space of the Amagansett house. I might point out that this is the inside of the Maison Cook, where the rotary action is. And this question of rotary versus frontality will come up shortly. But this, of course, is the photomontage homage à Rudolph inside the Amagansett house. It was this house that propelled Gwathmey into becoming a member of the New York-based Five Architects. I'm alluding to that familiar coterie that under Peter Eisenman's leadership shared the common credo that their generation had the responsibility of creating an American architecture capable of rivaling the compelling achievements of the pre-war European avant-garde, both formally and ideologically. Apart from Giuseppe Tirani and Theo van Dersberg, the primary referent and inspiration for three of these architects at least, Michael Graves, Richard Meyer, and Gwathmey himself, was indubitably Le Corbusier, to which Gwathmey's Fulbright Fellowship notebooks of 62 to 63 amply testify. Well, this is a page from the Sprunt publication, and this, which is a kind of combination of Gwathmey's notes about the modular and the house itself, and to some extent, I think, the modular was, to varying degrees, applied, particularly in the early work of Charles Gwathmey. All of this will be confirmed by the exhibition and seminar entitled Five Architects, held in the Museum of Modern Art in 1966, for which both Colin Rowe and myself wrote critical texts. Alongside Rowe's sophisticated skepticism, which would be fleshed out much later in his essay, The Architecture of Good Intentions, I wrote a more open, somewhat banal appraisal in which I saw the work of the five as oscillating somewhat uneasily between the vestigial classicism of frontality and the dynamic spatiality of rotational form, which in its turn, you could say, had close links to the vernacular and to the arts and crafts movement. These countervailing architectonic tropes, as first synthesized in Le Corbusier's Village of 1927, were to be returned to later in the work of the five architects through the conceptual stratagem of the 45-degree axonometric, as this format, pioneered by Auguste Choisy and Le Corbusier, was largely, I think, popularized in the US through the graphic representations of James Stirling's work, who had exploited this mode of projection in his early houses, one of which is shown here, or in his design for Churchill College, Cambridge, or in his projection of the Leicester Engineering Building of 1959. Notwithstanding the neo-Baroque come cubistic axonometrics projected by Graves in the mid-60s, above all perhaps in his Hanselmann House of 1968, the most forceful exponent of this rhetorical device was for a while Gwathmey himself, as this is undeniably evident in the axonometric of the Amagansett House, where we have in one and the same drawing both the dynamic spatial partie of the house and the implied rotational movement around its form. One might note, going backwards, that the Graves house is both partly frontal and rotational, as opposed to the peculiarly rotational character of the Amagansett house. Designed and detailed, I believe, in collaboration with Richard Henderson, who was then one of the partners, or momentarily a partner, this singular neo-Corbusian work took the form of a pinwheeling cubic space form, which, as it happened, was also a graphic preoccupation in the Cooper Union School of Architecture at the time, under the leadership of John Haydock, who had been appointed dean in '64 and was the 5th member of the New York Five. While Haydock took pains to distance himself from the neo-Corbusian ethos, as was evident in his diamond show. What have I done with that? Lost it. Yeah. Diamond show staged with the painter Robert Slutsky in 1966. He nonetheless emphasized a comparable axonometric presentation of the forms. One should note how the 45-degree skewing of the freestanding atelier in relation to the house in Amagansett would prompt the visitor to rotate around the two cubic forms so as to view the one in terms of the other and vice versa. I think I should leave that there. This conjunction initiates the theme of rotation in Gwathmey's domestic architecture, in that the rotation in question not only applies to the inner spatial dynamic of the sculptural form, but also to the way in which the viewing subject is induced to rotate around and through the work. While the spatial dynamic of the Amagansett house is undoubtedly neo-Corbusian, its architectonic syntax could hardly be more removed from the purist paradigm, inasmuch as Le Corbusier's Village of 1927 was a totally frontalized composition, the rotary spatial movement being confined largely within its interior. This image perhaps doesn't fully illustrate that point, but as in the Maison Cook, the energy is inside the cube and it doesn't emerge very much, that is, onto the exterior of the building. The rotational synthesis of the Amagansett house was the essential trope from which the rest of Gwathmey's domestic architecture unfolds. This synthesis merits further examination since it puts Gwathmey's house into a class on its own when compared to the houses realized by other members of the New York Five. Gwathmey conceived of the Amagansett house as being carved out of a cubic block, and this aesthetic illusion was sustained by the use of tongued and grooved cedar boarding as a continuous finish inside and out. While he insisted that this materiality was not a motif, he nonetheless concluded his later retrospective assessment of the house with the words, and I quote, "Within a limited budget, a formal partie and vernacular were developed that set a precedent for the later work." Thus, Gwathmey directly acknowledges that the vernacular character came from the flush-jointed, narrow, vertical boarding, which he even extended to the soffits of ceilings, irrespective of whether they were flat or pitched. As far as the exterior was concerned, it was just this grey character, stemming from the way in which cedar goes grey with age, which served to differentiate him from the rest of the five, who were virtually committed one way or another to the smooth, white finish inherited from the international style. This was a conscious return to the proverbial white architecture, particularly with respect to the work of Richard Meyer, whose language was otherwise close to that of Gwathmey. This ideological difference at the level of exterior finish may well have been due to the fact that Gwathmey had studied with Lewis Kahn at Penn and with Paul Rudolph at Yale. Without depreciating the importance of Gwathmey's dynamic plastic invention, this Penn-Yale background gave a particular emphasis to the expressive value of soundly detailed construction. This preoccupation was reinforced by Gwathmey's postgraduate internship with Barnes, from whom he seems to have assimilated a particular penchant for creating abstract minimal set pieces, be they domestic or otherwise, in tightly boarded construction, even though Gwathmey used this approach to achieve a much more concentrated rotational trope. The next four houses built by Gwathmey after his parents' house, that is to say the Strauss, Sendaker, Goldberg, and Cooper residences that he realized between 1966 and 1968, were all predicated on the manipulation of an equally compact cubic partie pris, even though these formats passed through distinctly different permutations, as the architect tackled in each instance a slightly different program and a decidedly different site. A more open, pinwheeling spatial configuration, bursting out of the confines of the original cube, is most decisively evident in the Cooper House, built in Orleans, Massachusetts in 1968, which I'm showing here as an image photograph and here as an axonometric of the way in which these semicircular bulbous forms punch their way out of the cube. In the Strauss residence, on which he collaborated once more with Henderson, bold semicircular and quadrant forms enliven an otherwise staid orthogonal two-story format, the whole being unified by twin monopitch roofs that cover the breadth of the entire house. Subtle formal spatial inflections serve to animate the overall form by both adding to and subtracting from the volumetric point of departure. The 45-degree counterform that played such a key role in the Amagansett house is reduced here to a mere quotation in the angled blade on the ground floor. Where is that? Lost it. I've just lost it seems, altogether. Anyway, all right. In the next Gwathmey Henderson house, the Sedaka residence, built in East Hampton in 1967, the virtual cube is more consistently maintained as a referent, with a freestanding spiral stair situated asymmetrically within a square plan so as to animate the otherwise static space form of the house. The three very simple moves impart a liberative dynamic to the overall volume. This is the freestanding chimney to which I will refer. First, the provision of a raised terrace, triangular in plan, opening directly off the living dining area. Second, a full-height plate glass window wall which affords access, visual and otherwise, to the terrace. And third, an aerodynamically profiled chimney shaft that closes the composition at the corner of the terrace in a kind of static response to the spiral stair which curves up from the living room to the semicircular mezzanine bedroom above. That's the spiral stair. And by the way, here you can see only too clearly the boarded finish on the interior of the space. This in turn overlooks the double height space. As in the two previous houses, circular forms are played off against an orthogonal matrix. In this instance, a drum accommodates the entry while housing the kitchen at grade and the principal bedroom above. The tubular handrail of the spiral stair seems to energize the entire composition through its movement. Once again, narrow cedar boarding is used as the primary facing material both inside and out. As Gwathmey wrote of the tight economic constraints which drove this design, quote, "The materiality was also basic: formica cabinets, vinyl tile floors, electric heat, and cedar siding on the interior and exterior. The selection of materials in these first houses, which I built as well as designed, and how they were detailed was thoroughly considered. Even though they look simple, craft and longevity were always and have always been pertinent obligations of the work." An elevated triangular terrace would also play a key role in the orchestration of the Goldberg House, completed on a wooded site near Manchester, Connecticut in the same year. This is the Goldberg House. In this instance, the two-story format is poised at the crest of a hill down which it subtly unfolds so as to culminate in the aforementioned terrace. On the entrance side of the house appears as a single-story structure, while organized about a split-level section, with the children's bedrooms being situated half a level below the main living floor and the master bedroom suite being conversely positioned half a level above. At this juncture in the evolution of his houses, Gwathmey began to move away from the Amagansett ideal, typical of the domestic work of the five, who conceived of the house as a freestanding aesthetic object. Instead, Gwathmey engendered a whole series of houses in which the expansive topographic aim was to extend the centrifugal form of the house out into the surrounding landscape, either as an outriding terrace spinning off the centroid of the house, or as a timber passerelle running off out into the dunes. This is the passerelle running off out into the dunes. The Amagansett partie becomes greatly expanded in the two steel residences constructed in the same year in Bridgehampton, New York, which we see here, one of them, and here the other. In these twin residences, built for two generations of the same family, Gwathmey plays with the idea of inflating the previously subordinate cylindrical elements to such an extent that they plastically encompass and overwhelm the basic orthogonal format of the rest of the house, as we can see from these axonometrics. The Cogan residence, completed in East Hampton in the same year, will be the first of his residences to entirely abandon the cubic partie of the Amagansett house in favor of a horizontal mass form where the major spaces, displaced by half a level at each end with respect to each other, are linked by a long ramp to the rear of the main volumes which face out over the pond. Although Gwathmey continued to represent the dwelling with his habitual cutaway axonometric, one notes that this representational mode was now incapable of embodying the linearly layered spatial concept of the house. Both graphically and conceptually, it was not possible to handle the attenuated spatial composition in the dynamic manner of the earlier houses. Gwathmey was only too aware of the cultural consequences of this shift in scale and complexity when he wrote, I quote, "The Cogan residence was our third large house. The steel houses built a year earlier were extensions of the small house ethic. They were primary and singular, larger versions of the carved, eroded, volumetric forms of the first series of houses. We learned that to simply expand the vocabulary and parts of those first small houses, to simply make them bigger was problematic. Extending the strategy lost the essence, the compositeness, and the tension. The resulting houses were less dynamic and less consolidated. In the Cogan residence, for the first time, the object building, with its articulated and small-scale representation, is combined with a large-scale referential pavilion structure. The object building is thus locked into the frame structure and extends horizontally and vertically through it. The counterpoint and juxtaposition between these two elements introduced an entirely different dynamic and level of enrichment into the work." End quote. As we've already noted, Gwathmey was the only one of the so-called white architects whose domestic work assumed a warmer and more accessible tone, one which stemmed from his penchant for finishing the structure in vertical cedar boarding, which mellowed to grey over time. With this warm, tactile finish, another amber within and grey without, Gwathmey was able to conjure up a modern modus vivendi which appealed to what was essentially an upwardly mobile Manhattan middle class who had acquired a sophisticated taste for a certain mid-century modern modus vivendi, irrespective of whether this took the form of open-plan vacation houses close to the beach, or gourmet dining in the Hamptons, or fast cars, or all these attributes and pleasures together at once. More than any of his contemporaries, Gwathmey had a feeling for the sybaritic way of life, and thus had an innate sense of the liberative context in which to fulfill these sensuous aspirations. In this regard, his plastically assertive yet spatially liberative houses, while being totally free of nostalgia, were nonetheless able to convey a feeling of domestic warmth. This ambience was greatly enhanced by the furnishing of the houses, which were also often largely induced by the architect, hence the prevalence in one house after another of Breuer's tubular steel chairs along with Le Corbusier's classic tubular steel pieces, dating back to the Salon de Tom of 29, plus the B12 Sonnet bentwood chair, also made famous by the Swiss master. The built-in closets, kitchens, dining tables, chimney breasts, and freestanding cabinets, which possessed an inherently sculptural micro-spatial function, were invariably formed out of finely veneered timber, or alternatively plastered or otherwise finished more cheaply in formica. The warm atmosphere of the whole might be accentuated by Marimekko bed linens, or the occasional Artec chair by Alto, or by a stellar print and a luxurious bed cover according to the client's taste and the mood of the moment. Although this did not exactly produce a total work of art, it was nonetheless a consciously cultivated high bourgeois climate. Much the same would obtain with the richly orchestrated apartment interiors that he created over the same period, which we first encounter in the Faye Dunway apartment, built into the Art Deco carcass of the El Dorado building overlooking Manhattan's Central Park in 1969. Here, Gwathmey covered the floor of the apartment with polished and waxed black slate, which he furnished with Mies MR dining chairs in chromium tubular steel and wicker. A warmer feeling of sensuous luxus was conveyed by the fur-covered bed angled towards the exterior terrace, while beyond was an exceptionally capacious walk-in closet lined with built-in fittings. This labyrinthine, yes, well, this of course comes from the Villa Savoie, slightly different version. This labyrinthine retreat was conceived as a sequence of action settings, passing from a sculptural bathroom en suite behind the bed to a sauna and separate shower tacked in beside the kitchen on the other side of a substantial wall. And then I thought I would show you, this is the Unger apartment, a series of these apartments covering the 10 years, I think, more or less, between 75 and 85. This is the Unger apartment. This, I think, is kitchen in the Swid apartment. This is also Swid apartment. This, I think, is the Geffen apartment. These kind of episodic spatial valves running throughout the interiors of these apartments, I think, are quite extraordinary. This is the Arango apartment, very monumental. using a blue stone, which I don't immediately recognize. And this is a plastic form in the Spielberg apartment, if I have it correctly. And this is Gwathmey's own apartment. And this is a pretty witty bathroom fitting in a Park Avenue apartment, unidentified. And this is astonishing, elaborate two-story apartment built inside some remarkable building. And this is somewhere in Central Park South. As Gwathmey was to put it in retrospect in 2004, the design of apartments involves negotiating the inherent constraints of existing conditions, whether planned configuration, ceiling height, orientation, views, window openings, structure, mechanical systems, plumbing, or code restrictions. These constraints, rather than being limitations, afford the opportunity for a different type of intervention and innovation. In its density, complexity, and spatial definition, the composite cabinet furniture strategy, as we interpret, results in the creation of autonomous objects that can be read as miniature buildings, end quote. It is difficult to overrate in retrospect the exceptional beauty and variety of these luxurious interiors built at great expense for the New York art collecting Hollywood elite. Gwathmey Siegel were able to indulge in these microspatial essays of poetic luxus and comfort without having to take responsibility for the exterior form, since this was de facto given from the outset. Frontality rather than rotation comes into its own in Gwathmey's work with the Berenson residence built in Rye, New York in 1976, and in the Taft and Demenil houses built in Cincinnati, Ohio, and East Hampton, Long Island in 1977 and 79, respectively. This is the Taft residence here. The Taft residence effectively brings Gwathmey's 20-year-long involvement with neo-purism to a point of culmination in a large complex broken into two distinct different elements. We see this frontal element followed by a kind of tail at the rear. All three mass forms are linked by a covered walkway at grade and a passerelle above, while the main house and the guest wing establish the confines of a large square terrace at grade, which serves as a mutual open-air living space set before a bucolic prospect lined with trees. It's not so easy to read this from this axonometric. Two features serve to extend the main body of the house and impart a markedly topographic character to the whole. A green sward which terminates in a ha-ha, precisely mirroring the width of the frontal screen, and secondly, a pergola covering the walkway between the car court to the rear of the house, and a mono-pitch greenhouse set against the northern boundary of the site. And of course we see this elaborate tennis court. As Gwathmey has written, quote, the Taft residence on 6.5-acre site overlooking the Ohio River consolidated all the previously discovered strategies. Instead of creating a composite building, here the program is fragmented in response to the client's desire to not have, despite excessive requirements, a big house. Each of the programmatic elements is distinctly articulated as part of a larger building site plan that extends the house and defines a series of outdoor spaces while engaging the landscape, end quote. The Demenil house, built in East Hampton in 1979, this is still actually Taft at night. This is Demenil's site plan. Elaborated on the frontal partie of the Taft house, taking it a step further by establishing a processional route towards the front of the house. Symptomatic of this general aggrandizement are the large areas of unshielded glazing. Like the rest of the five, Gwathmey seems to have had little interest in any kind of systematic sun control. Moreover, a virtually limitless budget had the effect of dissipating the dynamic spatial energy of Gwathmey's earlier houses, in my opinion. While the plastic orchestration of the interior still embodied something of the earlier formal rhythm, the house as a whole tended to fragment into a somewhat dissonant assembly of disaggregated episodes. But this is no longer the demonial house. Of all the independent professional practices launched by the New York Five, so to speak, there is little doubt that the exceptionally prolific output achieved by Gwathmey Siegel and Associates was the largest. Their record indicates that during the first 20 years of its existence, that is to say between 1964 and 1984, the firm designed and realized over 30 private houses plus 10 extensive university complexes, 17 large office buildings, and countless domestic and commercial interiors, not to mention a number of prominent museums, including their controversial 1982 extension to Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim in New York. Even if, as of now, one excludes the last decade and a half of their production, it is obviously impossible in the space of a single lecture to do any kind of justice to such a diverse and widely varying practice, should go back, which clearly involved not only the two principals but also countless assistants, which Gwathmey and Siegel went out of their way to acknowledge by name in their 20-year anniversary publication. Within this wide spectrum, the case may be made that the practice was at its architectonic and socio-cultural best in the field of residential accommodation. And while this is only too well known as far as their high-end luxury production is concerned, what has surely been insufficiently recognized up to now is the contribution that they made to the field of low-rise high-density housing during the short-lived US social housing boom of the 1970s, most particularly under the separate patronage of Ed Logue of the UDC in New York and Erwin Miller, acting for Cummings Diesel, I believe, in Columbus, Indiana. In this regard, I have in mind first the Whitney Road housing that they realized for UDC in Parenton, New York, near Rochester in 1972. But one should also not overlook the student housing that they designed for the State University of Purchase in 1973, shown here and here in plan, along with the cooperative housing that they projected for Reston, Virginia in the same year, shown here. And finally, the Sycamore Place and Pence Street housing that they designed for Columbus, Indiana in 1978. In all these works, they demonstrated an unrivaled mastery of economic unit planning and the clustering of low-rise, high-density housing form. This is the Whitney Road housing, Parenton. Aside from the brilliant way in which the Whitney Road housing was integrated into the gently undulating landfall of the site, the most radical aspect of this UDC 560-unit low-rise housing, completed at Parenton in 1975, was the subtly inventive manner in which it was able to recast the 1934 Radburn planning principle in such a way as to accommodate universal car ownership. The project description says everything one needs to know about the play between the two-story townhouses accessed from pedestrian courts and the single-story apartment units elevated one story above covered walkways lining the 4 internal cul-de-sacs which provide convenient parking at hand for both the houses and the apartments. I mean, we're looking here at the houses, and we're looking here, you see these these four arms that go down to these housing clusters, and the Yes, and the way in which these housing clusters work in a pedestrianized form, and the way in which the apartments are raised up over the parking and continuous walkway. And here we see the walkway, of course, and here, you know, continuous, on the perimeter, a continuous binding, enclosing band of two-story houses. And then there are these absolutely astonishingly economical apartment plans, which are also a key aspect of their skill. I will read from the site description of this, the office's site description, the description of the project. The site slopes from high points. Maybe I should go back to this image. Yeah. The site slopes from high points on the east and west sides towards its center. Townhouses and garden apartments are located in 4 linear cul-de-sacs. Each has its own parking area, and the units share open space in semi-enclosed green areas. Each family unit is provided with a covered parking area. The pedestrian circulation is designed so that the pedestrians may walk on covered walkways and through green areas throughout the site without coming into contact with traffic. The apartments are located in the southern portion of the site with close access to the community center, shopping and bus facilities. The townhouses serving larger families are oriented towards the open grass areas consisting of private outdoor spaces. The type of construction is slab on grade, prefabricated wood wall panels, wood frame, aluminium sash exterior, stucco interior, drywall, electric baseboard heating. This is one of the courts. This is one of the open greensward courts. Of this scheme I wrote in '82, quoting myself, "At Perrington, Gwathmey and Siegel have succeeded in upgrading the Radburn concept so as to accommodate the increased density of automobile use in the last quarter of the 20th century. At the same time, they have postulated a housing pattern which is open to a changing sequence of readings as one passes through different kinds of space developed by the grid formation. Thus, while maintaining a certain scalar relation to the suburban context, this pattern is much more urban in feeling than Radburn, and this sense of urbanity derives not only from the stoa-like perimeter walkways, but also from the pedestrian mews or clusters which extend the layering of the scheme in depth. Thus, Perrington provides the alternative of 3 different spatial experiences: the urbanity of the street, the labyrinthine quality of the mews, and the bucolic community of the inner garden courts, shown here. The cedar cupboarded timber framed Sycamore Place housing, built in Columbus, Indiana in '78, was equally adept at relating a 3-story staggered housing cluster of 8 apartments per floor to a 14-unit entry car park at grade. Once again, the description adequately accounts for the social intention and the ingeniousness of the invention that is brought to bear on its resolution. Thus we read, this is the plans, and you can see they fit this description. The 3-story stepped plan makes each vertical row of 3 apartments articulate, identifiable, and house-like, while acting to deinstitutionalize the building. The corridors become a sequence of rooms with natural light and views at both ends. By adding a balcony terrace to each apartment, the private space is extended both physically and psychologically." End quote. The unbuilt, this is from the details of the apartments I've just described. The unbuilt alternating monopitch 2-story Pence Street carpet housing projected for Columbus in the same year attempted to apply the plastic syntax of Gwathmey's Amagansett house to multiple 2-story, 3-bedroom back-to-back courtyard units accessed through front yards via short walkways extended into the fabric from integrated parking. This is a work that, in my view, invites comparison to Sterling's village infill housing prototype exhibited at Aix-en-Provence in 1955. This brilliant prototypical piece of low-rise high-density housing, which postulated nothing less than a normative economic form of Motopian land settlement, would seem even now, 30 years later, to constitute a viable and socially accessible alternative to the suburban sprawl by which we are surrounded. Built or unbuilt, these low-rise housing schemes testify to a trajectory in which the functionalist hard line inherited from the Weimar Republic architects is transformed through the new humanist vernacular of the East Coast into socially accessible residential land settlement patterns that Gwathmey Siegel proposed during the heyday of US housing in the 70s. In this sector of their production, Gwathmey Siegel will come closer to the social, political, cultural aims of the interwar European avant-garde than perhaps any other works projected by the New York Five. In making such sweeping evaluations, we should note that what may be achieved by any architectural practice at a given moment in history is largely determined by powerful economic forces which, although they are somewhat off-stage, nonetheless shape the degree to which the socio-ecological fabric of the environment may or may not be rationally resolved and maintained. Perhaps we pay insufficient attention to the fact that what any single architect may achieve at any particular moment in time is very much conditioned by the invisible forces seemingly lying outside the constraints of the period. The five architects were no more able to return to the forms and social programs of the pre-war European avant-garde than they were unable to create a truly compelling civic architecture comparable to the public works that were realized in the States after the catharsis of the American Civil War. I'm alluding to the received discourse of the École des Beaux-Arts that prospered in this country during the Progressive era, and in which, of course, most of the institutions of the post-Civil War era were created. This is our condition, for as Martin Heidegger put it so succinctly, we are all, each one of us, thrown into history. And what seems to be possible in one era will not be possible in the next, and so on. It is clear, for example, that despite our best efforts, we cannot build civic institutions with the same conviction as the architects of the Progressive era. Not only because we lack the architectonic syntax with which to do so, but also because we no longer believe quite in either the ideology or the efficacy of these civic institutions. And much the same may be said for the panoramic Usonian vision of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was totally convinced as to the manifest destiny of the states, and from whom, significantly enough, the New York Five, including Gwathmey, maintained a scrupulous distance. It's an ironic fact that at the very end of Gwathmey's career, Wright emerges as a ghostly protagonist with whom he would be involved, first surely in the addition to the Guggenheim Museum, and then again via Paul Rudolph. He would indirectly encounter him in the restoration and expansion of the Art and Architecture building in Yale. And I'm, of course, talking about this. We're sitting right in it. And but I'm also talking about this, which is the section through the restored building and the addition. And I'm also talking about this, because it's my belief that this building ultimately has, as its point of departure, Wright's Larkin building in Buffalo of 1904. Significantly, what had been separately possible for Wright and Rudolph, namely the creation of a convincing microcosmos, would prove somewhat elusive for Gwathmey at the end of his career, as we may tell from a retrospective comment he made towards the end of his life. Gwathmey's restoration addition to Paul Rudolph's Art and Architecture building in Yale brought him to confront the uncanny interplay between individual fate tradition, and history. For here, via Rudolph, Gwathmey had to come face to face with that aspect of the American vein that ultimately stemmed from the Usonian spirit of right. One has the sense that Gwathmey was only too aware that this leviathan of a building had been inspired by Wright's Larkin building. And here I would like to argue that it was no more possible to add in a convincing manner to such a self-contained vision as Wright's Guggenheim as it would be to add to the equally introspective neo-Wrightian art and architecture building in Yale, particularly when one was reduced to using a lightweight, membracious syntax derived from the discourse of the interwar European avant-garde. And here perhaps we have some inkling of the sheer force of tradition and history, which, while assuming an architectural form, in fact transcends architecture in as much as it depends on it for its fulfillment on a belief system which derives from the society as a whole. I mean, I think this is a historic nexus here where the Rudolph building faces off Kahn's Yale Art Gallery with the other Kahnian museum down the street. Here perhaps we can have some inkling of the sheer force of tradition and history, which, while assuming an architectural form, in fact transcends architecture inasmuch as it depends on an entire belief system deriving from the society as a whole. It is my contention that here in the very heart of the Yale campus, at the fatal intersection, as it were, between Rudolph Kahn and Gwathmey, and then by proxy via Rudolph Wright, we are witness at the level of belief with an incipient, gnawing loss of faith in the progressive historical destiny of the United States. I would like to put it to you in lieu of a conclusion that culture and tradition act in society in a given moment in disconcertingly uncanny ways, and what is feasible, believable, one might say, at one moment in history is neither credible nor possible in another. And in the case of Gwathmey, set before the mammoth challenge of the art and architecture building, excuse me, this impossibility became, in my view, doubly intractable, inasmuch as he was caught between two antithetical tectonic traditions, neither of which could be convincingly continued. That is to say, on the one hand, the abstract, part theosophical, part socialist, utopian socialist discourse of the European avant-garde, circa 1920-1939, and on the other, the romantic Usonian vision of Wright, that singular American heritage that in the midst of the post-war Pax Americana, the New York Five elected to reject. Wright patently believed, like Louis Sullivan before him, that it was possible for the United States to create a monumental architectural culture rivaling not only the moribund classicism of Europe and the École des Beaux-Arts, but also the monumentally heroic civilizations of the ancient world. The trans-historical challenge, as it were, lying within the traditions of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. And surely the fact is that Rudolph, while not in any way directly imitating the language of Wright, nonetheless evidently entertained comparable romantic convictions. This surely is the significance of the statue of Minerva rising up in the heart of the building at the moment of its completion, along with the colored plaster cast reliefs from the ancient world that surreptitiously and mysteriously line the staircase and ancillary rooms of this historic concrete monolith. Although Gwathmey was not inclined to comment on this tectonic unconscious, so to speak, he acknowledges nonetheless the masterwork status of the building, as he was to put it about the critical feedback he had already received in his interview with Douglas Brunt, and I quote, "It's been pretty brutal. They've rediscovered Rudolph, for which I'm happy. I think restoring Rudolph's building adds to the modern architectural legacy, and it should be acknowledged as an important work. It's a masterwork. But at the same time, I think our building is incredibly sensitive, deferential, and enriching to his building. Nobody actually understood the program of our building and how we maintained Rudolph's courtyard idea and how the roofscape is a reinterpretation of the courtyard and how we maintained the views from the studios and actually added the dynamic that you're in architecture, looking at architecture, they're confronting each other, having a dialogue. So far, all that people see is the facade. I have to say that the majority of press critics, most of whom are failed literature, architecture, or history majors, self-arbiters without retribution, were unfair. And Gwathmey goes on to further to actually use the word mean-spirited. And my only hope is at the end of this discussus that you will not think that on balance I have been unfair or at the very least mean-spirited. Thank you.
I think I speak for all of us when to say that Kenneth's assessment of Charles's work is comprehensive and thoughtful in the extreme. It opens up beyond what we have in the gallery, the full spectrum of the practice, which was so important for so many of us and also for the history of architecture. So I applaud that great piece of work, and it was not mean-spirited at all. Normally we have questions. I don't know if it's appropriate at this moment, but if there are any burning questions, I suppose we can entertain them. We have a little time. Is there anyone who wishes to ask our speaker anything? I guess you've answered all the questions.
I don't believe that.
Well, there's always an opportunity to ask a question over a drink in the gallery on the second floor where you can enjoy each other's company and the marvelous work of Gwathmey Siegel. Thank you very much.